I don't think I've seen many films receive as much hate from YouTube film critics as the Matrix sequels have.
Even before the crowd-hating sequels came out.
What went wrong with the final installment of the rather tragic Matrix trilogy?
They simply were just vastly disappointing movies.
As we pray that Keanu pulls off what he's never done before. Follow up a great action movie with a sequel that doesn't suck.
I feel that I could have justified making this video on the notable rise in appreciation for the sequels seen online. But what actually motivated me to make this video was my experience as a teacher working closely with young adults and seeing how different the younger generations are reacting to the three Matrix films, especially compared to the 1999 generation that experienced these films in a very different context. In my school, I host a film club where we discuss movies past and present. Thanks to the popularity of the John Wick films, I noticed a lot of my students were eager to discover the Matrix trilogy. While many of my students loved the first Matrix, I noticed a surprising amount of them were indifferent to it. But one thing I never felt was the absolute reverence for the first film that was widespread in 1999. In fact, my students are usually surprised when I show them how YouTubers from the 1999 generation often describe experiencing the first Matrix as being this revolutionary, almost life-changing experience.
No one really expected it to be as incredibly mind-blowing as it was in every way.
I went to see it at my local Warner Village cinema, and I was just blown away by it, like everyone else at the time.
Everyone saw it as this deep, mind-blowing experience.
It's actually hard to recall in this process just how different and refreshing and new everything about The Matrix felt in 1999.
The culture of haters. This is Chris Stuckman.
How was it? Amazing!
He's a YouTuber who to me is a perfect example of how certain people reacted to The Matrix and its sequels when they were first released. As you can see from this video of Chris making his own Matrix content, and by what he says in his reviews, he was no casual fan, much like a lot of these YouTubers were.
Today we decided to go back in time to summer 2003, a time when 14-year-old me was waiting in line 6 hours early to catch a glimpse.
The first Matrix meant the world to him, and in his reviews of the sequels, he describes feeling intensely that they betrayed the spirit of the original film.
I think it's a very disappointing sequel. Yes, and an overarching failure to understand what made audiences connect with the first film so much.
To understand the unprecedented level of hype for the sequels, you have to go back to 1999 to see how much The Matrix impacted people. A generation of filmgoers ran out of cinemas declaring The Matrix as the new Star Wars.
There was always moments in cinema that one particular movie will inspire others and forward the art of visual effects. And when The Matrix hit the scene, it made such an impact and influenced many people in the industry.
No one had ever seen anything like it. The video essay called The Matrix, Really That Good explains how blown away an entire generation of moviegoers was with this film.
Seriously, generational dividing lines do not get clearer than this. The Matrix hit theaters in March of 1999, and overnight, it felt like the entire action genre molted right out of its skin and an entirely new creature emerged. Anime, kung fu, video games, the club kid scene, mass market air quotes, anarchism coalesced into singular force that overwhelmed the old guard.
This video is one of the most detailed I've seen, explaining why this film was so influential back then and maintaining that his generation never really got over it.
It doesn't get more basic than this, gang. The Matrix kicks ass. In fact, The Matrix kicks so much ass so definitively, I feel like the popular culture is still numb.
His only oversight, in my opinion, is assuming that every generation afterwards would feel the same way about that film as his did. Different generations take on the Matrix trilogy. I think Chris Stuckman totally understands what made his generation connect with the first Matrix film back in 1999. But I think it's presumptuous to think that later generations were going to connect with the first film the way his did.
But in the context of the moment in which The Matrix emerged, there's just no getting around how much the notion of a detached office drone vanishing into cyberspace culture, discovering the secrets of the system, and becoming a master of his own destiny spoke to the cultural anxieties of the age.
For example, What in 1999 was considered the most badass action scene for one generation has been pointed out to me as cringeworthy to a generation used to public shootings. What some fans from the 99 generation consider to be boring philosophical discourse in the sequels.
Instead, we're bogged down by lengthy, philosophically confused monologues about determinism.
Is considered interesting to a generation engrossed in similar forms of conferencing. This generational change in attitude is specifically mentioned in Just Right's On Understanding the Matrix Sequels video. In fact, many of my students who really like the sequels considered these scenes amongst their favorites of the entire trilogy. What was considered mind-blowing action in the first film is considered pretty tame by the standards of the new generation.
The Matrix has amazing action sequences that to this day are not rivaled.
But the only game changer is its technology. And even that at times is starting to look really dated.
In 1999, what were seen as unconventional philosophical concepts derived from, at the time, niche genres, has lost its novelty to a generation that has been overexposed to these things.
When in truth, dozens of science fiction stories and movies have done this idea before. The idea that our reality is an illusion. Hell, even some of the effects it's famous for were being done before this movie came out. They just weren't perfected yet.
Any new content or characters that didn't match Chris Stuckman's expectations, much like the haters from his generation, were dismissed as being filler or all wrong.
There is an overabundance of characters in this movie. Captain Mifune, Captain Locke, the Council, all of these characters just feel like filler. It all just feels like stuff that could be forgotten. What does this have to do with anything? I just want to see certain things happen in this film. Big, gigantic, bloated film that was very disappointing.
I came to realise that once the sequels were announced, people had their own ideas of what Zion would look like and how the battle would take place. I think it went against expectations and fans were disappointed.
While fans of the whole trilogy often point out that these are some of their favorite characters, some haters will dedicate so much time trashing the bad CGI, which I've seen fans of the trilogy easily forgive, especially once they know that Keanu Reeves actually acted out most of this stuff through the earliest forms of motion capture. It's the same way fans of Lord of the Rings suspend their disbelief in the face of noticeable CGI. They don't hate the films because of it. Most of the criticism these YouTubers express come off as petty gripes.
I'm sorry, I can't help but see how dumb that is. It's just the robots form a head that speaks.
Those who loved The Matrix became heavily emotionally invested in the idea that Matrix 2 and 3 would be the definitive saga of their generation, going as far as revolutionizing cinema itself.
Matrix Reloaded was going to be perfect. It was going to be the greatest movie ever. It was going to be a transcendent movie experience. It was going to take us to the heavens and back again. The ultimate question of life was going to be answered by The Matrix Reloaded. Everything was just going to come into focus, and this film was going to take us to Valhalla and back, and everything was going to be amazing. And it kind of was disappointing.
You may think this is a bit excessive, but the rare thing about The Matrix that separates it from basically any franchise ever is that its universe lends itself to endless storytelling possibilities. Now, think of this intense emotional investment and add 4 years of people's wishful expectations on the content they were hoping to see, from the types of characters to the type of narrative they wanted, and this is at the heart of the anger and bitter ridiculing that you often see on YouTube.
Okay, so maybe not a handful of things better. Probably just the Zion thing. Yeah.
Instead of giving fans good times with God Neo, the fun, triumphant hero's quest that they felt they were promised at the end of the first Matrix. Keanu Reeves with the Wachowskis created films that felt like tragedies, films that turned out to express a more grim and cynical take on the hero's myth. Things were not laid out for fans as conventional Hollywood films tend to do. These movies had to be deciphered, interpreted through work, with the Wachowskis wanting their audience to create meaning for themselves. To some hardcore fans from the 1999 generation, this was an absolute betrayal of what they perceived to be the true spirit of the original film. Anything less than the perfect films they had envisioned was going to be met with disappointment.
It's a watchable film. But the idea of a sequel to The Matrix being just watchable is so sad.
The disappointment became very deep, and a lot of them started to argue that the sequels were objectively bad movies. So, to justify that view, these people began to criticize the films on a technical level.
I don't dislike The Matrix Revolutions because I don't get it. Oh, well, you just didn't get it, because I'm smarter than you. I've deeply analyzed Revolutions. I've read a lot of quotes from the Wachowskis. I've watched all the documentaries and featurettes I can get my hands on. My issue with The Matrix Revolution, it's the filmmaking on display.
Speaking as if they were authorities on cinema with actual professional qualifications.
But this is where the Wachowskis really fall short in screenwriting. They don't always respect their audience. And all of a sudden you're seeing all these things and you convince yourself that it's this amazing masterpiece when it's really not.
Despite his research, YouTubers like Stuckman often get the narrative or the symbolism they're criticizing wrong. One of many examples of this can be found in his review of The Matrix Revolutions, as Chris explains his disappointment at how the Merovingian is portrayed as the devil.
And by doing so, they have to press a button that says help with a P crossed out. Oh. I wonder if the Merovingian is supposed to be the devil. It's a film that has a lot of symbolism, but it's not the type of symbolism where you have to kind of dig and discover it for yourself.
But he's totally wrong on the symbolism that he's referencing. You see, hell being spelled with one L means that the film isn't referencing hell from Christianity, but hell from Norse mythology. This symbolism relates to the Eye of Odin and is meant to affect our interpretation of the characters in this scene, including the ones in the background, as well as the overall meaning of the story. Also, I think mentioning documentaries and research is a little misleading. The Wachowskis have always purposefully avoided interpreting the films for the audience. Other than a few sound bites on surface level stuff, there is nothing official on the detailed meaning of these films. The documentaries that Stuckman references merely talk about the process of making them. The subjectivity of film criticism. YouTuber Doug Walker, aka the Nostalgia Critic, made a really insightful video with YouTuber Angry Joe on how subjective film criticism can be. Basically, throughout the review of Man of Steel, they argue that liking or disliking a film really depends on what you are willing to bring into it, and what you are personally willing to forgive about the film. For example, some will roll their eyes at Superman's Jesus imagery, while others will love it. YouTubers like Stuckman have often posted reviews that totally go against what the majority of critics and audiences have thought. This is common of his colleagues as well, and often you'll even find YouTubers who will praise films they love by choosing to overlook the same things they criticize the Matrix sequels for. The best example I could find of this double standard is from YouTuber Rob Ager. Rob really dislikes films like the Matrix sequels and Blade Runner 2049.
I am going to absolutely rip it to shreds here because I thought it was terrible.
Yet, ironically, he released a review defending the first Star Trek film, Star Trek the Motion Picture from 1979, as not only the greatest Star Trek movie ever made,
but one of the best sci-fi movies of all time.
The irony here is that he's defending a film that even the actors themselves criticize for being one of the most boring and disheartening science fiction blockbusters in history.
We had a bad script that just never worked. It was always a struggle to try to figure out how to bring some life to this project. My concern always was the writing. Let's go for some fun here. We've been so somber this entire movie. There's been no humor, no charm. which Star Trek was full of. Charm and humor, full of it.
William Shatner himself called the film sluggish, stating at the time that it outright killed the franchise. Now, there are ample cases of actors being openly critical of things they were in.
Best season ever!
But unlike these examples, the actors from the Matrix sequels are very proud of what they made.
If you look at Reloaded, the ideas and action that are in that film are absolutely astounding. Astounding. The ambition, the scope of what they were reaching for, and the way that they had the continuation of the idea that the one is really the sixth one. Fantastic.
Moreover, Rob Eger's justification for praising Star Trek 1 can literally, word for word, be what fans of the Matrix sequels have been saying since 2003.
Instead, this narrative is elevated into a cerebral adventure of colossal science fiction ideas. When it gets the special effects right, it's unbeatable. There are shots in this movie that knock the hell out of most of the CGI stuff today. It gets me thinking about the universe, technology, evolution, and philosophical issues. The concepts are grand and imposing. The film plays on our fear of the unknown and our fear of the universe as an imposing place in which man is just an insignificant biological accident. The motion picture is a story of intelligent diplomacy, bureaucracy politics, grand-scale evolution, and though I haven't given any plot spoilers to this effect, it's also a story of core human philosophy. I love that the filmmakers had the guts to tackle such a god-scale story, being that they could just have fallen back on the established Star Trek TV series formula. Sometimes I've felt like I was evolving while watching the film. It amazes me that any adult could sit and watch this film and not have that kind of response.
Rob Eger even defends one of the most ridiculed scenes in Star Trek history, where Captain Kirk stares at a new model of the Enterprise for a full 4 minutes and 26 seconds, which is an eternity in cinema. This is because he was willing to forgive that aspect of the film.
Now we got the money, we've got to give him a big effects movie. So it was all about the ship, and this effect, and that effect, and we're going through this thing, and now we're going through that thing. Nothing about the characters.
At least Rob Eger is honest about his lack of qualifications. But much like YouTubers who like to trash the Matrix sequels, he still knows how to use meaningless lingo that laymen in filmmaking often use to give their views a sense of credibility.
It's super high concept, and it's far more aesthetically artistic and subliminal than any other Star Trek movie I've seen. Star Trek the Motion Picture is a massively ambitious and intelligent film. Too intelligent for many in my view.
Those who questioned the haters back in 2003. Let me close off with film critic Roger Ebert, who ironically is Chris Stuckman's biggest idol, and how he praised both The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions. In his review of Revolutions back in 2003, Ebert specifically noted how, unfortunately, fan bias at the time and unrealistic expectations would make these films feel like a big disappointment to some. Many of his colleagues, for example Empire Magazine's William Thomas, recognized this predisposition as well. This sentiment was echoed by actor Bernard White, who plays Ramachandra in the sequels. He wrote a remarkable 1,400-word defense of the Matrix Revolutions, in which he goes in depth on this sense of betrayal that I've been talking about throughout the video. In his essay, he wrote, "The Matrix Revolutions is nothing, I mean nothing short of brilliant. The depth and complexity is well worth a closer look that, it seems to me, some of these critics were not willing to take. It seems to me that they did not want to risk falling in love with this film. Why? I believe it has to do with betrayal." Bernard White analyzes why the haters were not ready for the Wachowski story about achieving peace instead of attaining all-out victory versus a dehumanized enemy. He points out in detail why, to the haters, the sequels just felt all wrong. In conclusion, Roger Ebert is Chris Stuckman's all-time idol, and I find it to be very ironic that Ebert's reviews of the trilogy are more in line with how later generations would come to see these films. The key word here is detachment. In these reviews, he openly states that he is completely disconnected from any hype and enjoyed the films with an open mind. Ebert even echoed views that I started hearing years later from my students students about the first Matrix film. In his review back in 1999, he stated that the first film was a bit overrated, claiming that the ending was cliched and, because of his vast knowledge of past films, found its concepts to be quite unoriginal. While not as consistently excellent as the first Matrix, he notes that the sequels have so much going for them. So when Chris Stuckman says that there's nothing to these films, it comes off as resentful and honestly ignorant. To me, these are exceptionally well-made films that deal with compelling topics like the essence of free will and determinism, the nature of power, of purpose, belief, and systemic control. They deal with the conflict of moral duty versus personal duty, and ask if we even understand what free will means, because we might, in the end, just be slaves to our emotions. The grim Matrix Revolutions, which in my opinion cannot be seen as a standalone movie, to me has a lot of value because it deals with the realization that victory is impossible. So we have a story about humanity in its most vulnerable state, trying to make it all work in the face of Armageddon. To me, that is something beautiful and is far more inspiring than almost any blockbuster I've seen since. To wrap this up, my message to the Wachowskis, Keanu Reeves, and the rest of the cast and crew that poured their souls into all three films is thank you. And I think you can rest easy.
But they had a lot more story to tell, you know, so again, I'll put that disc on there and I'll hang out with it. And I hope that people, you know, anyway.
There are a lot of people who appreciate these films deeply. It might be cliche to say this, but it seems these films were actually ahead of their time and are finally getting the appreciation they deserve. Thanks for watching.